Have you ever had the feeling of being completely lost, of waking up one day with a tightness in your heart, unable to explain exactly why, as if something inside you was disconnected from life itself, not knowing who you are anymore, where you're going, or why certain situations keep repeating like an invisible cycle that traps you, no matter how much you fight against it? This silent confusion, this feeling of drifting, even when everything around you seems to work for others, is more common and deeper than it seems. Maybe you're fulfilling obligations, showing up, replying to messages, going places, doing what's expected. But inside, it's as if an essential part of you has gone silent. A void that's hard to name. A feeling that something is missing, even if you don't know exactly what. Life, which once made sense, or at least seemed to, now seems to have lost its color, its brightness, its direction. And this feeling, contrary to what many think, isn't just passing melancholy. It's not laziness, ingratitude, or drama. It's a signal, a reflection of the soul beginning to stir in silence, trying to show you that something inside you can no longer be ignored. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, delved into this exact territory. For him, this feeling of being lost was not a failure. It wasn't a mistake that needed fixing. It was, in fact, a calling, a turning point in the inner journey. Jung noticed that many of the people who came to him suffering were not necessarily sick, they were in transition. What suffered in them was the soul trying to break free from mental and emotional structures that no longer made sense. And here's the most provocative point of his view. What if this feeling of disorientation, emptiness, and confusion isn't a problem to be eliminated, but rather an invitation to be accepted? A call from the psyche saying that the time has come to look inward and begin a process of transformation? What if pain is not an enemy, but a guide? Jung believed this was the first step of individuation, the process by which we become who we truly are, not just what others expected us to be. For him, the soul doesn't scream with words, but with symptoms, patterns, dreams, silences. And often when you feel lost, what's happening is that the old structure of your identity is beginning to collapse because it can no longer hold the truth that pulses inside you. It's as if a deep, authentic, unknown part of you is knocking on the door, asking for passage. But to hear it, you have to stop. You have to silence the external voices. You have to have the courage to face discomfort, uncertainty, the void. Jung didn't offer ready-made answers. He offered a path, a hard path, yes, but deeply transformative. And it all begins with an honest question. What if this feeling of being lost is, in fact, the soul trying to find itself? According to Jung, the beginning of the inner journey does not occur in moments of clarity or stability. On the contrary, it is precisely when everything seems to collapse, when we feel most lost, most ungrounded, that the true crossing begins. This state of confusion, anguish, and emotional breakdown is not an anomaly, a failure, or something that needs to be quickly erased. Jung saw this moment as the exact point when the soul begins to move toward the deepest and most essential process of psychic life, individuation. This term, coined by him, represents the path by which the individual ceases to be merely what the world has shaped. Conditionings, expectations, family and social patterns, and becomes who they truly are in their entirety, with lights and shadows, virtues, and contradictions. But this process does not start with inspiration. It starts with a fall, with a loss of control, with the dissolution of certainties. The ego, this part of us that believes it is in command, that builds conscious identity based on experiences, beliefs, and social roles, begins to weaken in the face of the brute and unknown force of the unconscious. This fall of the ego does not happen in an orderly way. Often it comes with existential crises, ruptures, psychological symptoms, intense dreams, or seemingly random events that shake the structure of everyday life. Suddenly, what once seemed solid, our values, desires, life plans, spiritual beliefs, or even relationships, begins to fall apart, as if something is slowly being dismantled from within. And in this collapse, this feeling of loss of identity, a new possibility begins to emerge. But it doesn't come with promises of immediate happiness or magical solutions. It comes with silence, confusion, and difficult questions. And that frightens us. That's why the modern mind, conditioned to avoid discomfort at all costs, seeks to escape this pain through all sorts of distractions. Jung already warned about this. When the ego collapses, it's common for a person to try to anesthetize themselves, whether through excessive consumption of information, social media, compulsions, shopping, addictions, or any immediate pleasure. That can numb the inner chaos for a few moments, but ignoring the collapse does not prevent it from continuing. The unconscious, as Jung said, does not disappear just because you try to ignore it. On the contrary, what is repressed, forgotten, or denied gains even more strength behind the scenes of the psyche. It will manifest in repetitive behavioral patterns, physical and emotional symptoms, conflictual relationships, intense dreams, voids that nothing seems to fill. And the most dangerous, the further we distance ourselves from the unconscious, the more it dominates us without our awareness. The shadow, this hidden side of the psyche that carries everything we deny in ourselves, grows stronger in the darkness, waiting for a chance to express itself. Therefore, for Jung, facing this collapse of the ego is not just a psychological challenge. It is an act of spiritual courage. It is the beginning of a descent into one's own inner world where nothing is as it was before, and where every step demands radical honesty. Inner chaos is not the end of the path, it is the gateway. It is the moment when, painful as it may seem, the soul begins to emerge. The feeling of being lost, of no longer recognizing oneself, of questioning choices, and sensing that life has lost its axis, often does not arise out of nowhere. According to Jung, this deeply distressing psychic state is frequently a precursor to something even more profound, the manifestation of the shadow. The shadow, in analytical psychology, is not an abstract or mystical concept. It is extremely concrete, albeit invisible. It is a real part of our psyche, composed of everything we repress, deny, reject, or have simply never been able to acknowledge in ourselves. It consists of emotional and psychological contents that did not fit within the idealized image we constructed of who we should be. Since childhood, we have learned, often unconsciously, that certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are unacceptable. Therefore, we hide them, we store them away, we push them into the dark corners of the mind. It might be an aggressive impulse, a deep insecurity, repressed sexuality, stifled envy, an unprocessed trauma, or even talents and desires that were silenced to please others. Every part of ourselves that we deny does not disappear. It settles silently in the depths of the soul. And over time, this accumulation gains strength and a life of its own. This is what Jung calls the shadow. When the shadow begins to emerge, it does not appear subtly. Often, it manifests through intense and disproportionate emotions, such as outbursts of anger, persistent feelings of guilt, irrational fears, sadness without apparent reason, chronic irritability, or anxiety attacks. It can also show itself through self-destructive or repetitive behavior patterns that seem to follow an invisible logic, as if we were being driven by something we do not understand. Jung compared this to trying to pilot a plane blindfolded. Without recognizing the shadow, we become its captives, even without realizing it. It infiltrates our relationships, our failures, our judgments of others, especially our harshest judgments, because, as Jung also said, what irritates us most in others is usually a reflection of what we deny in ourselves. being lost then may be the soul's cry asking for this hidden part to finally be acknowledged. You may be facing, once again, that same emotional pattern you thought you had overcome. You may be feeling anger that seems to have no origin, a lingering resentment, a sadness that insists on returning. All of this could be the shadow trying to express itself, and the more we resist looking at it, the more it manifests in disguised ways. The shadow does not disappear through repression. It only transforms into destiny. Jung was direct when he stated, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This is perhaps one of the most impactful phrases in his entire work. It reveals that what we ignore in ourselves does not cease to exist. In fact, it gains power. And this is precisely why self-knowledge is not a luxury or an aesthetic choice. It is an urgency. Because by not recognizing what is hidden in our own psyche, we are driven by internal forces that sabotage us, limit us, and distance us from who we could truly be. The shadow is not our enemy, it is part of us. A part that waits silently for the moment to be integrated. Among the many reasons that lead a person to feel lost, Jung highlighted one that is especially present in modern life: excessive identification with the persona. The persona, according to him, is not negative in itself. It is necessary. It is the face we show to the world, the adaptation we make to fulfill social roles. In the professional environment, we use a language, a posture, an image that is expected of us. Within the family, we shape our behavior to maintain harmony. With friends or on social media, we take on a character that we believe is more accepted, better understood, more praised. The persona is like a garment we wear to move through the world. The problem begins when we forget we are wearing a garment and start believing it is our own skin. Living exclusively through the persona is like building a house inside a mirror. You see yourself reflected, but never in depth. Each time you repress what you truly feel, what you genuinely think, or what you actually desire, just to maintain the image, you move further away from who you are in essence. This distancing is not immediate but cumulative. Gradually, the soul becomes silent, the inner light dims, and a diffuse feeling of disconnection begins to settle in. You perform tasks, achieve goals, receive applause, but none of it fills you, because it is not you who is being recognized, but the persona, that which others projected, expected, or needed you to be. Jung warned that the price of over-identifying with the persona is high. It may seem easier to please, go with the flow, be well-liked. But the more you adapt to others' molds, the more you distance yourself from your inner nature. And there comes a moment, and this moment comes for many, when the internal facade can no longer be sustained. You wake up one day, perhaps in silence, perhaps in the middle of a crisis, and realize you no longer know who you are. That your decisions were guided by the fear of disappointing, your achievements were made to prove something to someone, your relationships were maintained out of convenience or obligation, and that all of this, despite apparently working, has lost meaning. This is the pain of having betrayed the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the totality of the psyche, what you truly are in your deepest essence, beyond the ego, image, and masks. When you distance yourself from it, you live only a fraction of what you could be. The persona, at this point, ceases to be an instrument of social integration and becomes a psychic prison. An elegant, comfortable prison, even praised by others, but a prison nonetheless. Many feelings of apathy, demotivation, confusion, or emptiness have their roots precisely in this disconnection. The discomfort is not because you are doing something wrong in a practical sense, but because what you are doing is no longer aligned with your inner core. The voice of the soul is muffled by obligations that are not yours, by dreams that were never born in you, by choices made to uphold images. And the more you feed this persona, the further you feel from yourself. For Jung, crisis was not a mistake to be corrected, nor an accident to be avoided. It was an inevitable, almost sacred stage in the process of inner transformation. Rather than being an end point, the crisis was, for him, a kind of portal, a rite of passage that separates who you were from who you are destined to become. He saw in the collapse of the old an opportunity for the birth of the new. He compared this process to alchemy. Just as ancient alchemists dedicated themselves to the symbolic task of turning lead into gold, the human being in crisis is undergoing a psychic alchemy, where the lead of illusions, masks, and attachments must be melted, purified, and transmuted into something essential, true, and lasting. The pain that arises in the midst of the crisis is not gratuitous. It has a function. It tears away layers that no longer serve, destabilizes fragile structures, silences artificial noise. It forces you to stop. And in that stopping, something dormant begins to awaken. The soul, which had been ignored, finally finds a crack to manifest itself. The feeling of being lost in this context is the first sign that something inside you is trying to emerge, something that no longer accepts living on the surface, something that demands presence, listening, courage. Jung believed that this psychic pain, this deep restlessness, this feeling of existential collapse, is a cry of the soul for you to break the automatic cycle of life and begin to live with authenticity. Modernity, with its quick fixes and constant distractions, has taught us to flee from crisis at any cost. It teaches us to anesthetize, to run, to pretend everything is fine. But Jung warned, what is not faced repeats, what is ignored infiltrates, and sooner or later returns with greater force. Therefore, the crisis should not be avoided, but understood. It is the symbolic language of the soul saying that the time for change has come. The time to let die what no longer serves, to let collapse the roles that no longer uphold the truth, to make space for something new which can only emerge from inner silence. And this silence, contrary to what many imagine, is not emptiness. It is fertile ground. It is there, amidst the pain, confusion, and apparent darkness, that a new consciousness begins to germinate, a new relationship with yourself, a new listening, deeper, more honest, more connected. Jung saw this journey as a call to leave the known territory of the persona, the ego, the conventions, and enter the labyrinth of the soul, where the true gold of the psyche resides. And this crossing, although difficult, is not a punishment. It is a path of return, a path of reunion with what you always were, but had forgotten. For Jung, the process of individuation is the core of the human experience. It is not a fixed destination, nor an external goal to be achieved. It is a continuous movement back to the psychic center, to what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, of inner completeness. Unlike the ego, which seeks control, recognition, and security in external structures, the self represents the deepest wisdom of the soul, a silent guide that calls us to integrate all that has been divided, rejected, or forgotten within ourselves. To individuate, therefore, is to become whole, not perfect. It is to embrace both light and darkness, both gifts and wounds, both virtues and impulses that cause discomfort. This journey requires courage. It is not easy to abandon false certainties, assumed roles, and inherited beliefs, because to truly begin, it is necessary to deconstruct. One must go through confusion, doubt, the discomfort of no longer knowing who one is. Jung said this process is rarely peaceful. It happens through crises, losses, disturbing dreams, unexpected confrontations. These moments force us to leave the surface of life and dive into the depths of the unconscious. And the first step of this dive is not technical, intellectual, or theoretical. It is emotional. It is an act of radical honesty with oneself. It means stopping the stories we tell ourselves. It means looking inward with unarmed eyes and asking, what am I avoiding? Where have I betrayed myself? At what point did I stop listening? To myself. This internal honesty is a break with superficiality. And it is this that begins to open space for a new inner order, an order not imposed from outside, but born from the most authentic layers of the psyche. The process of individuation also requires patience. It does not happen in a straight line, nor does it follow a predictable schedule. It is full of back and forth of apparent setbacks that later reveal themselves as essential movements. It is like crossing a vast, unknown territory where every symbol, every dream, every internal conflict carries meaning. The language of the unconscious is not logical. It is symbolic, paradoxical, profound. And learning to listen to this language through imagination, reflection, observation of internal patterns is a vital part of the journey. Along the way, integration happens. Parts of the shadow begin to be recognized, not as enemies but as vital aspects of the psyche. The ego learns to relate to the self not as a rival, but as an internal guide. And this reconciliation between the parts, this daily effort to not deny who you are, to not project what you feel, to live authentically, is what gives meaning to individuation. Because in the end, it is not about becoming someone better. In the eyes of the world, it is about becoming whole again. And this can only happen when you commit to walking consciously, even when the path is uncertain, even when everything seems to be falling apart. For Jung, dreams were much more than mere disconnected images produced by the brain during sleep. They were direct manifestations of the unconscious, symbolic messages sent by the self to guide the ego on its journey of maturation and self-knowledge. When someone feels lost, fragmented, or without direction, dreams become even more important. They reveal what the conscious mind does not want or cannot see. They are attempts by the unconscious to compensate for imbalances in the psyche, to bring to the surface forgotten content, repressed emotions, and unlived potentials. Jung observed that in moments of greatest confusion, dreams became more vivid, more intense, almost as if the psyche was screaming for attention. This is no coincidence. It is a language, and this language does not express itself through direct words, but through symbolic images that often defy logic. Animals, landscapes, unknown figures, absurd situations all carry a hidden meaning that cannot be understood by reason alone, but needs to be felt, explored, and interpreted with sensitivity. When you write down a dream, you are taking a fundamental step toward inner listening. You are telling your unconscious, I am listening. And over time, this practice creates a bridge between the internal and external worlds, between what you think you are and what truly lives inside you. Jung saw dreams as compensations for the ego. In other words, if during the day you live in a very rational, controlled way, denying emotions or desires, the dream may show exactly what is missing. It may reveal repressed anger, unlived sadness, suffocated desires, childhood fears that still hold power over you. That is why Jung said, dreams are letters the unconscious writes to the conscious mind. But letters only have power when they are read. Ignoring dreams is like refusing the help of an inner guide who sees what you do not see, who understands what your mind cannot yet comprehend. Each symbol that appears relates to you, your experiences, your personal history. And the repetition of certain themes or emotions is a clear clue that something inside you is trying to manifest, trying to gain space in your consciousness. The process of recording and reflecting on dreams does not require deep technical knowledge, but rather an attitude of curiosity and listening. Ask yourself, what is this dream trying to tell me? What does this image represent to me? Which part of me is being revealed here? Gradually, the pieces begin to fit together. And even if there are no immediate answers, the simple act of paying attention already starts to reorganize the inner world. Because the unconscious wants to speak, it always has. The question is, Are you willing to listen? From Jung's perspective, archetypes are universal patterns that inhabit the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that goes beyond individual experience. They are not fixed figures, but living forces, dynamic symbols that emerge in dreams, fantasies, myths, and behaviors, carrying profound meanings that transcend cultures, eras, and personal histories. During the process of individuation, these archetypes manifest spontaneously, especially in moments of crisis, transition, or inner transformation. The hero, for example, often appears when you face a challenge that demands courage, overcoming, and movement. He represents the drive to grow, to leave the comfort zone, to fight one's own inner monsters. It is that moment when you feel the need to make a difficult decision, take an uncertain step, face pain in order not to betray yourself. The hero is not invincible, but he is determined. He makes mistakes, falls, suffers, and yet continues, because he senses that something greater awaits on the other side of the crossing. The wise old man appears when logic is no longer enough, when reason reaches its limit and a new form of knowing is necessary. He represents intuition, inner wisdom, the silence that guides. Sometimes he appears in dreams as an ancestral figure, a teacher, a guide who speaks not with words but with symbols. His presence indicates that it is time to listen more and control less, to trust what you feel even without concrete proof. Then there is the trickster, the archetype of the trickster, the provocateur, who appears precisely to shake certainty. He arises at moments when you feel too safe, too sure, too in control. And then something happens, an unexpected mistake, a fall, an absurd twist that disrupts everything. But the trickster's role is not to destroy for destruction's sake. He reveals what was hidden, exposes contradictions, opens spaces where there was once rigidity. He is creative chaos, the break that prepares for renewal. The innocent represents original purity, the unarmed gaze, hope not yet corrupted by suffering. He appears when you need to remember what is essential, when you need to trust again. He is not naive in a pejorative sense, but deeply connected to faith, lightness, surrender, to the flow of life. Sometimes it is necessary to reconnect with the innocent, to walk again with a more open heart. The Great Mother, in turn, may appear as nurturing or destructive, depending on the phase you are in. She represents the primordial feminine, the origin of all, the symbolic womb where the psyche regenerates. In dreams, she may appear as a maternal figure enveloping nature of fertile darkness. Her call is to nurture, but also to confront the fear of surrender, vulnerability, and dependence. Recognizing these archetypes is like deciphering the invisible map of the soul. They indicate what stage of the process you are in, what kind of challenge you face, what inner strength needs to be activated. When you begin to see them not as external characters, but as living aspects within yourself, the journey ceases to be random. It gains direction. Each archetype brings a question, a lesson, a possibility for transformation. They do not dictate the path, but illuminate the inner landscape. From Jung's perspective, the self is not a goal to be achieved like conquering an external milestone, but a deep reality to be rediscovered. It has always been there, in the most authentic core of being, waiting to be recognized. It is not about building a new identity or shaping an ideal version of oneself according to standards of success, spirituality, or perfection. On the contrary, the self is the point of balance among all internal polarities. It is the synthesis of the psyche where conscious and unconscious meet, where the ego bows before something greater within itself. Often, what prevents this reunion is precisely the excess of mental noise, the accumulated masks, the roles played throughout life. To please, belong, survive. The process of returning to the self, then, requires detachment, not in a mystical sense, but psychological, detaching from the rigid persona, from false certainties, from the need for constant approval. It is a painful process because, in many cases, it means undoing everything that was built with effort but was not in harmony with the essence. The self is not a static state of peace or continuous enlightenment. It also includes chaos, conflict, uncertainty. Jung saw the self as the symbol of wholeness, not perfection. It is in this center that the soul finds stability amid movement, meaning amid doubt, coherence amid contradictions. Reconnecting with the self is like returning to a home that has always existed, but was forgotten beneath the rubble of haste, pain, and conditioning. That is why Jung said, the process of individuation does not lead you to become someone completely new, but to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. It is about removing layers, not adding. About listening to the voice that whispers beneath the noise, not creating a new one to stand out. The authenticity that emerges from this encounter is neither performative nor imposing. It is silent, firm, and true. You don't need to prove it to anyone because it simply is.